teased this morning, this lesson today I've denominated Civil War. And again, it's not about the war of the 1860s that this nation was embroiled in. It has to do more of a war that goes on, I think, within most of us, if not all of us. And maybe not just a one-time event, but maybe it's somewhat constant. And I wanted to give you some hope and some assurance from the written word that these kinds of internal conflicts that go on with us is pretty normal, and it's something from which we can overcome. And the text of the lesson is now Romans chapter 7, and I've excerpted just a couple verses. Romans chapter 7, verses 9 and 10, and then I skip forward to verses 21 through 24. Now again, we've been camping out in the book of Romans now for about the past 2 months. But it's one of my favorite books of the Bible because Paul writes with such clarity and also talks a lot about grace, which unfortunately for me growing up in a church, we didn't hear a lot about grace. It was a lot about rule keeping, but I didn't really hear a whole lot about grace. And so in my later life, I've kind of learned to really enjoy and understand the subject. I had the benefit of knowing a person called Harry Robert Fox that I will call the Apostle of Grace. Learned a lot from him about Romans and about grace. And so I've just decided to take this church to the extent that you'll allow me through the book of Romans to explore this subject among others. And interestingly, in Romans chapter 7, Paul is wrestling with something that I think is a conflict that he had, but is one that we all experience. And here's the text. This is Paul writing, so listen to what he has to say. I was alive before I knew the law, but when the law's command came to me, then sin began to live, and I died. The command was meant to bring life, but for me, it brought death. When I want to do good, evil is there with me. In my mind, I am happy with God's law, but I see another law working in my body, which makes war against the law that my mind accepts. That other law working in my body is the law of sin, and it makes me its prisoner. What a miserable, miserable man I am. Who will save me from this body that brings me death? As you know, I like to start out most of my messages with a story or an anecdote, and it's no different this morning. And this story, I'm telling you, is absolutely, positively true. I have not changed the names to protect the innocent. I have not done anything to alter the story whatsoever. You're going to hear firsthand the unadulterated confession from this person about how I violate the law. And the problem is, not only have I violated the law, I don't want to stop. And this misdemeanor conduct of mine really began innocently enough. I live in Ramona, and the path that I take to work takes me north on Highland Valley Road. But before you can get to Highland Valley Road, you're stuck on Dye Road, and that's spelled D-Y-E, but you almost D-I-E on that road because I am convinced that the entirety of California wants to turn west off of Dye Road onto Highway 67 to get into part south. I don't. I want to go north on Highland Valley Road, but I have to wait in this interminable line of cars, all in a single file, all waiting to turn west onto Highway 67. And I wait, and I wait, and I wait, and I wait, and then I start mumbling to myself, you know, there's got to be a better way than this. And then I found it. I found the shortcut. You see, about a quarter of a mile to maybe half a mile away was where this shortcut began. And what it was the dirt shoulder of Highland Valley Road, or Dye Road. And I figured, hey, you know, it's worth a try. I am tired of waiting in these interminable lines to go north on a road that everybody in California wants to go west on. So I swerved to my right. I bid farewell to all the people who were stuck in the line of traffic, And I thought I'd just take my chances. And it led me straight to the head of the line, headed north on Highland Valley. And I was so proud of myself. I mean, Lewis and Clark would have been proud of me and the discovery that I'd made. And from then on, church, I was ahead of the pack. I was always at the lead of where I wanted to be. And every morning, while all the other cars were waiting in their long, interminable line, I would just turn onto my little private Autobahn and race right up that right-hand shoulder. And I applauded myself for apparently seeing something that so many other people had missed. I was surprised, quite honestly, that no one had figured this out or discovered it earlier. But then again, honestly, few have my innate navigational skills, and so I figure, okay, I'm ahead of the pack there too. And that was with the exception of one very clever CHP officer who happened to be behind the bushes, behind the right-hand shoulder of the road. And honestly, if it were not for some unfortunate driver that had apparently discovered my little private Autobahn, I would have received the illustrious season's greetings from the state of California, if you know what I mean. And it was then that I noticed the sign. It said, closed shoulder. Steve, can I ask you a favor? Can you go back and advance the key there? Or Curtis? Because I want you to see the sign that apparently I hadn't seen. So after the meet and greet, go one, Curtis, and that'll be the passage that we read. Okay, one more. That's the passage we read. One more. Okay, that's my little private Autobahn right there. See that car racing up the right-hand side? Okay, then go to the next one. Thank you. That's when I saw the sign. Shoulder closed. In other words, the shoulder was not meant for travel. It was meant for the area in which you cry if you get caught traveling on the closed shoulder. Now, church, I mention this to you because of the text that we've just studied. See, my problem is not what I did before I knew the law. See, before I knew the law, I didn't think there was anything wrong about my little private expressway up the right-hand shoulder. My problem now is I know the law, and I still want to break it. Take down the sign, perhaps. And you'd think that I would have no desire to use that shoulder again. But the truth of the matter is, I still kind of do. Part of me still wants to use that shortcut, you know? Part of me wants to break the law, and each morning I have this argument with myself. My ought to tells me, come on, Randy, you know it's illegal. My want to answers, but I've never been caught yet. My ought to says, well, the law is the law, and my want to counters with, but the law isn't for careful drivers like me. It's for other unlaw-abiding individuals. Besides, the 5 minutes that I'll save getting to work, I'll spend in prayer. And my ought to doesn't buy that, number one, because my ought to says, why don't you just pray in the car while you wait with the rest of California in line? Right? So here's the point. Before I knew the law, I was at complete peace, right? Now that I know the law, there's this insurrection that has started to occur within me. On one hand, I know what I ought to do, but on the other hand, I don't want to do it. My eyes read the sign, but my body doesn't want to obey. What I should do and what I end up doing many times are two entirely different matters altogether. I was better off, really, not knowing the law. Now, Does any of this sound vaguely familiar to you? Thank you. Does this sound like something that you've had to deal with? Because for many of us, I think what I've just described can kind of describe the itinerary of the soul. Before coming to Christ, church, we all had our shortcuts, right? Honestly, boasting was our ticket to popularity, right? Lying was a shortcut to us getting a little power. And then we found Christ, and we found grace, and we saw the sign. And the question that I want to ask each of you, has this ever happened to you? Okay, let me give you an example. Maybe you've got a hot temper. And then you read from Matthew chapter 5, verse 22, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be judged. And you're thinking, wow, I didn't know that. And maybe you tend to exaggerate, make your point a little more flowery and with a little bit more flourish than generally others would do. And then you read in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, say only yes if you mean yes, and no if you mean no. If you say more than yes or no, it is from the evil one. And you start thinking, I've been talking this way all my life. I didn't know that. And maybe you enjoy people seeing your generosity. It's the holiday season, right? And so you want others to see how generous you can be during this time of year. And generosity is good. Boasting about it, well, again, Matthew chapter 6, verse 3 says, so when you give to the poor, don't let anyone know what you're doing. And you're thinking, oh boy, I didn't know that was wrong. Or maybe you have a habit of categorizing people into convenient little boxes, describing people that fit into particular areas of your life. And then you read from Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, don't judge other people or you will be judged. And you're thinking, son of a gun, I never was told that judging was a sin. All these years, you and I have been taking shortcuts because we never saw the sign. But now that you see it, now that you know it, it would have been so much easier if you had just not seen the sign, right? But now the law has been revealed to you. So what do? Well, this battle that all of us are waging is identical to the battle that Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 7. And I call it the civil war of the soul. And how welcome, when you think about it, is Paul's confession. I mean, really. This is coming from the Apostle Paul, the person who wrote the vast majority of the New Testament from which we study and live. I mean, these statements are coming from Paul. How good it is, I think, to know that Paul struggled just like the rest of us. Those who have been amazed by God's grace have been equally amazed by our sin. Because why do I say yes one day to God and I say yes the next day to Satan? I mean, once I knew God's command, why am I not eager to obey them? I mean, shouldn't these conflicts cease now that I'm a Christian? Now that I've put on Christ and I'm trying to live and walk in the way that He wants me to go? Shouldn't all this stuff just stop? And the truth of the matter is, no, it doesn't stop. It continues. And these are the questions that Paul is raising somewhat rhetorically in Romans chapter 7, but he's also writing to himself because Paul is struggling with these very issues. And these are the questions that a lot of us as Christians ask as well. I mean, maybe you've hit your head against the wall. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever seen this happen before, but like you watch a bird. Like around my house, we have sparrows, and you see these sparrows, and we've got some, panes of glass, And apparently these sparrows see the reflection in the glass and they think, oh, my long-lost sister, and bam, they hit the glass and then they fall down. They don't kill themselves, but they stun themselves, and they're kind of there flopping around for a few minutes until like the lights come back on, and then they get up and they fly away. And sometimes I think we do that as human beings. We see something, we smack the glass, and then we're just laying there in a daze, confused as to what just happened. I mean, are your weaknesses within you something that stun you, like the bird we were just talking about? I mean, how about your words? Do they ever stun you? Maybe your thoughts. Do they ever surprise you? How about your temper? How about your greed? How about your gossip? Does that ever stun you? And you're thinking, I'm a Christian. Why am I doing these things? But now you know. And now you have an internal civil war to wage. And the good news is there's a few tools, a few weapons that Paul provides to us to help you if this describes you. First is, Paul wants you to remember your position. Your position in life is as a child of God. That is who you are. So your position in life is as God's child. Now, some interpret the presence of this battle as apparently God's abandonment. Have you heard that argument? Well, if you're such a good Christian, why do you have such a bad temper? Or why do you gossip? Or why do you go out and drink yourself to death? Or why are you flirting with that other woman? If you're a Christian, you wouldn't be doing that. And you start thinking, you know what? I think that person's got the point. Maybe I'm not. Maybe God has abandoned me. Maybe God's left me. Because here's how that argument goes. It goes as follows. I'm a Christian, right? My desires, however, are anything but Christian. No child of God would have these kinds of battles. Therefore, ipso facto, I conclude I must be an orphan. God may have given me a place back then when I first became a Christian, but he has no place for me now. That's how the argument goes. But church, that's an argument that comes from Satan. That's what Satan wants you to believe. That's what Satan is trying to tell you. If he can't seduce you with your sin, quite honestly, what he does is he'll let you sink in your guilt. That's why the story seems to have some legs. Not because of what you did, but the guilt over what you've done. Nothing pleases Satan more than for him to have you cower in the corner and be embarrassed that you're still dealing with some old habit that you've been trying for a lifetime to kick. God's tired of your struggles, he whispers. Your Father is weary of all of your petitions for forgiveness, he says. And many believe him. And they spend a lifetime convinced that they are disqualified from the kingdom of heaven. But honestly, this is going to sound a little harsh, but honestly, whoever told you that you deserved forgiveness in the first place? I mean, really. When you came to Christ, did he know every sin that you'd committed up to that point in time? Yes, he did. Did Christ know every sin that you would commit in the future? Yes, he did. So Jesus saved you knowing all the sins you would ever commit until the end of your life, right? Right. You mean he's willing to call you his child even though he knows each and every mistake of your past and your future? Yes. God is very good. All the time. And all the time, what, church? God is good. It sounds to me as if God has already made his point with you in your life. Because if your sin were too great for his grace back then, he would have never forgiven you in the first place. So it isn't like your temptation. It isn't like these sins that seem to beset you are some late-breaking news flashes in heaven and God's thinking, oh, well, I didn't see that one coming. I didn't bargain for that one. Well, that's just a little too big for me. No. I mean, nothing comes as a surprise to God. He knows your past, He knows your present, He knows your future, and He has decided to forgive you anyway. So is there any reason to think, church, that the one who received you the first time won't receive you each and every time? He always will. Besides, the very fact that you're under an attack must mean that you're on the right side, don't you think? I mean, if you're being attacked for doing good stuff, doesn't that mean that maybe you're doing the right thing and that's why you're being attacked? I mean, did you notice who else had a hard time with this? It's the Apostle Paul. And I want to just bring out for you in Romans chapter 7, verses 14 through 25, some of the things that Paul says, because I want you to note the tense in which Paul is writing, whether it's past tense, future tense, present tense. Here's what he says: I do not understand. It is sin living in me. I do not do the good I want. I see another law working in my body. What a miserable man I am. Do you note the tense? He is talking in the present tense. This is the Apostle Paul, who is dealing with these issues presently. He's not describing some struggle in the past, but a struggle in the present. And I want you to just kind of think about this, that for all we know, Paul was struggling with this very issue while he's writing the letter to the church in Rome. Seriously, Randy? Paul was struggling with these issues while he's writing a book in the Bible? Well, yes. I mean, how much more effective would Satan be than doing that? Because maybe Satan was just a little bit concerned that if he allowed Paul to write these words and struggle with these issues and still find God's grace, what kind of cataclysmic effect could that have on the kingdom of Satan, knowing that God's grace is sufficient to save you? Why wouldn't Satan be working on Paul as he's penning the letter to the church in Rome? Isn't it possible that Satan could have feared the fruit of that particular epistle to the church meeting in Rome? Couldn't it be that he fears maybe the fruits in your life too? I mean, could it be that maybe you're under attack constantly, occasionally, whenever it happens? Not because you're weak. You're not under attack because you're a weak Christian. Maybe you're under attack because you might become a strong one. Perhaps he hopes that in defeating you today, he'll have one less missionary, he'll have one less writer, he'll have one less singer, he'll have one less giver to fight with in the future. Okay, so remember, your position is as a child of God, but your principle is the Word of God. When you're under attack, our tendency is to question the validity of God's commands. Let me explain that. We rationalize like I do with driving on the shoulder, because here's how my rationalization went. I saw the sign, but surely that's not for people like me. I'm a good driver, and I just want to go north while California is going west. Surely that sign doesn't apply to me. And once we start knowing the law, we begin to rationalize the law. Oh, well, it couldn't mean that, or it doesn't mean that, or it doesn't really apply to me. It applies to other people reading this, but heaven forbid, not me. But by questioning the validity of the law, I minimize, at least in my mind, church, the authority of the law. And for that reason, that the law is holy, His command is holy and right and good. So if we wanted to start rationalizing the possibility that, well, this law doesn't apply to me, it applies to the other bad people, Paul is saying, hey, look, the word is good, it's holy, it's right, it's just. It applies. And the root word that Paul uses here for the word holy is hagios. That's the word that he uses. And hagios, when translated, literally means different. God's commands are holy because they are different. They come from a different world. They come from a different sphere. They come from a different perspective. And in that, pardon me? My car is beeping? Or a car is beeping? You think it's mine? Would you tell it to stop, please? I'll tell you what, Zoe. Thank you. Thank you. Don't drive on the shoulder. Thank you very much. See, now you've been listening to this lesson. Thank you very much. And thank you, because, I mean, the interruption couldn't have been any more timely. Because here's what I'm trying to explain. We read the Bible and we sometimes rationalize it by saying, well, that doesn't really apply to me. That applies to really bad people, and I'm not in that category of really bad people. But it's the same application as the sign that said, shoulder closed. Because in that context, I will tell you that the lawmakers for the state of California and the county of San Diego are not necessarily the thoughts that I share with them. In fact, I frequently disagree with a lot of our politicians and a lot of laws that I think, quite honestly, are silly. But their thoughts are not my thoughts, clearly. They are concerned for the public good. I am concerned about my own personal convenience. They want what is best for the county. I want what is best for me. They know what is safe. I know what is quick. But they don't create laws for my pleasure. They make laws for my safety. And church, God does the same. He hasn't created laws for your pleasure. He created laws for your safety. What we consider shortcuts, thanks, Norm. What we see as shortcuts, God sees as disasters. And God doesn't give us laws for our pleasure. He gives us laws for our protection. And in seasons of struggle, and I think we all have them from time to time, we must trust in God's wisdom and not in our own. Because He designed the system. He knows what we need. But since I'm a stubborn person, it's me that thinks I know what I need. And my disrespect, quite honestly, for the shoulder closed sign, if you really want to be candid and think about it, reveals a very ugly part of myself, doesn't it? Me looking at that sign, saying it doesn't apply to me, reveals an ugliness deep down inside, doesn't it? Because had I never seen that law, maybe then I wouldn't have known how truly selfish I am. We're not lured so much by the shorter commute as some of us are just kind of lured by the sign. Isn't there within each of us sometimes a voice that says, I wonder how many times I could drive down that shoulder and not get caught? But the moment we begin asking those questions, we've crossed into an invisible arena of fear. Because we fear getting caught, don't we? We fear getting the season's greetings from the CHP in the state of California. We fear that. And the problem is grace was given to us to deliver us from that fear, but now, because we know the law, we end up going back into the fear from which we were first saved. And it's amazing to me how quickly we can return to that state. Grace told us that we didn't have to spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders and into the rearview mirror and consider all the past stuff that we've done. Grace told us that we're free from that. Grace told us we're free from the guilt on our consciences associated with the stuff of our past. And honestly, don't we know better? I mean, really, don't we intellectually at least know better? And if so, then what has happened? What's happened to us? Why are we so quick to revert back to our old ways? Or as Paul writes in Romans chapter 7, this time verse 24, what a miserable man I am. Who will save me from this body that brings me death? And simply stated, Paul is saying we are helpless to battle sin alone. And aren't we glad that Paul answers that rhetorical question in verse 25? The question, who will save me from this body that brings me death? The answer, I thank God for saving me through whom? Jesus Christ our Lord. So the same one who saved us first is there to save us still. There is never a point at which any of us are any less saved than when you were first saved, the first moment He saved you. I mean, just because you were grumpy at breakfast maybe this morning doesn't mean that you were condemned at breakfast, right? I mean, when you lost your temper yesterday, you didn't lose your salvation, did you? I mean, your name doesn't appear and disappear and appear and disappear on the book of life based upon your moods, does it? Because Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verse 1, there is now no condemnation for those who are, what? In Christ Jesus. Did you hear that? There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Now, of course, there is a difference in stumbling in your faith and completely abandoning it. We all stumble. If you abandon your faith, well, you're going to abandon your hope at your own peril. But if you stumble in your faith, as we all do, even the Apostle Paul, who wrote most of the books of the New Testament, he's struggling. He's dealing with this internal civil war, and he's trying to figure it out. And finally he concludes, you know what? Thank God for Jesus Christ. Because otherwise, I couldn't do this on my own. You can choose to walk away from your faith at your own peril, as I just said. But no power in existence can take your faith from you unless you consent. Nothing. You are saved, church, not because of what you do, but because of what Christ did. And you are special, not because of what you do or because of what you are. You are saved and you are special because of whose you are. And church, as a reminder, you are His. And because we're His, then maybe we should just forget the shortcuts and stay on the main road. I mean, He knows the way, right? He created it. So maybe the best roadmap in our life is deal with your safety first and don't take any shortcuts. God wrote His Word and gave us His words not for our pleasure, but for our protection. Because in the end, He wants to see us. After this journey is complete, He wants us to be with Him. But He's not going to twist your arm to get you there. He'll show you the map, and He'll tell you how to get there. He'll even provide the vehicle by which you can drive to get there. That's his son, Jesus Christ. That's how you get there. But if you don't jump in the car, you can never make the trip, right? So what God has done is provided us an avenue, a way to be with him forever, eternally. But he gives us signs along the way. And he's really encouraging us to not really deal with the shortcuts, avoid those, because they could be potentially disastrous. Instead, think of your safety first, because he did. He sent his son Jesus to die for you. So the next song that we're going to sing is Stand Up for Jesus. We're going to be standing as we sing that song so that you won't be lying as you're singing, so you will be standing. But the challenge in the song is to stand up for Jesus. That means not just get up off the pew and stand up, but in your life, in your walk, in yourself, in these struggles, in this civil war, for whom will you stand? Will you stand for Jesus, or will you stand for something else? And the challenge is to stand up for Jesus. So let's stand and sing.